Thank you for joining me on the Darren Chatter podcast. I'm going to be reading some of my blog posts that I have written so that you can consume this information in an audio format versus reading the blogs if this is more to your liking. I'm going to share with you stories from my past as an athlete, as a coach, as a salesperson, as a business professional, as a VP of sales. Everything that I have learned and amassed along the way in my 50 years here on planet Earth, I'm going to hope to share with you in order to help you shorten your learning curve, understand maybe a little different way to look at things, and hopefully learn a few things along the way. So here was the podcast you tuned in for. I hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to me when you can and let me know your thoughts. Thank you. Hello again. Thank you for joining me for podcast number 189, entitled Andy Roddick, the most successful bad player ever. For those of you who are not huge tennis fans like I am, Andy Roddick was an American-born player. He's from Austin, Texas, was number one for a brief period of time, won several majors, and was in an epic Wimbledon final that he lost to Roger Federer. One time was a huge part of the Davis Cup team, which is the U.S. representation in world competition. Had an interesting game style, was known for having a huge serve, and according to the critics, not a lot else, which I'll touch on in this conversation. So now that I gave you a little bit of backstory, here is the podcast as I intended. As most of my friends know, I'm a huge tennis fan. I grew up watching some of the great players in the late 70s and early 80s as a kid, and I never really stopped watching and following the game from there. I remember missing school one day in September because my dad and I were up till midnight watching Jimmy Connors in his epic run during the 1991 U.S. Open. Yes, I'm that old. Jimmy orchestrated several come-from-behind wins at the age of 38 to make a run to the semifinals that year. It wasn't just amazing sport, it was amazing theater. Jimmy Connors was commanding the crowd like he was a conductor in front of an orchestra. It was amazing. And I wanted to be just like Jimmy after watching that. He was one of the standout American tennis players at that time. He and John McEnroe and a couple of others competed on a world stage, and the sport was huge at that time, maybe bigger than it is now in terms of popularity. Fast forward a couple of generations of American tennis, and several names would stand out. One in particular that comes to mind, and that would be Andy Roddick. Unfortunately for him, he came along during the era of Roger, meaning Roger Federer, and suffered many a loss, as almost everybody else did, to Roger Federer, and does not get the credit he deserves because of this. Roddick was number one in the world for a bit, made 3 Wimbledon finals, losing to Roger Federer in each. He won the 2003 U.S. Open and was in the top 10 for 9 consecutive years. Sounds like a great resume, doesn't it? Well, it is. There's no question about it. But Andy was consistently in the shadow of a few others during his time and was looked to as a guy with a huge serve and no other real weapons. To quote him from an interview, he once said this: "I used to hear a lot that all I could do was hit a serve. I couldn't volley, I couldn't hit a backhand, I don't return well, and other people would turn around and tell me that I'm underachieving. I am the most successful bad player ever." If you read only the information in the paragraph above that quote, you would never guess that Roddick would hear anything but praise. Not true, but welcome to real life. My main point in this podcast is that you need to focus on what you do, what you can do to the best of your abilities, and block out all the other noise. Yes, we all have room for improvement somewhere, but unless you are getting advice from someone who truly knows what they're talking about, which is hardly anyone, by the way, then it should all be classified as noise. People who barely know how to hold a racket, such as sportscasters and sports writers and fans in the stadium, all cast judgment from the outside looking in. Think about that. Someone sitting in the stands is telling Andy Roddick that he is doing certain things wrong. That makes zero sense. And yet so many of us fall into the trap of not pursuing things that we want because even one person says something negative to us. If you put into perspective what I just said, I hope it helps you understand what I'm trying to do with my efforts in my blogs and my podcasts. You need to block out the noise and focus on what you're doing. You need to ignore the haters and the doubters and the naysayers because their feedback does not matter. At the most, it should be considered fuel for the fire. But personally, I would rather just tune it out. Now, here's the tricky part. This also applies to the fans, the idolizers, people who think that you walk on water, because that's not true either. Don't fall victim to the noise that the haters make, but certainly don't fall into the trap of drinking the Kool-Aid that all of the adorers shower you with in their praise. You are just a human being like everybody else. Yes, you may have a talent for something or are on your way to separating yourself from the masses, but that doesn't make you a better person. It makes you better at that particular skill, period. Believe me when I tell you, some of the most successful athletes I have ever met and been around are absolute hack human beings. Don't get it twisted. We all should take a page out of Andy Roddick's book when it comes to this stuff. He never lost his sense of humor in good times or bad. After his crushing fifth set loss to Roger Federer again at Wimbledon, he went into the press room and did probably the least fun part of his job, which is to sit there fielding questions from reporters. As he sat there, he made a few jokes as he always does, but he held his head high. He knew he had given everything he had that day, and he came up 2 points short. He got outplayed by one of the greatest players of all time. When asked his thoughts on the marathon match that day by a reporter, which, by the way, it was over 4 hours and a 16-14 loss in the fifth set, Andy simply said, "I lost." And in reality, that really did kind of sum it up. It was an epic performance by both players, some of the highest level of tennis that could have been played, and he came up just a tad short. We all want to win, to be great, and to be remembered, but things don't always go as planned. The moral of the story is that if you do your best, that is enough, regardless of the outcome. Roddick has success at the highest level, and yet people still think to some degree that he underachieved. In my opinion, if his peers didn't make that statement, then no one else has the right to be heard. If you have not done so, please read the famous quote, "Man in the Arena" by Teddy Roosevelt, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Tune out the noise and go do what you do. I wish you luck in your endeavors. Now, some extra thoughts on that stuff. As a competitive athlete, it's probably easier for me to identify to some of the things that Andy Roddick said. I was guilty of the opposite. I always measured myself against others, and I probably, in retrospect, at this point in my life, looking back on what I did and the tools that I had and all of those things factored in, I probably at least maximized my potential, possibly overachieving in certain circumstances. I didn't have Roddick's raw talent. I didn't grow up with taking lessons from the number one racquetball player in the world at that time to develop my game at an early age and then win every tournament that I ever entered, things like that. That wasn't my story. My story was I started late. I was a skinny kid. I had a lot stacked against me. I didn't have any money to get lessons or travel with or anything like that. But I still found a way to make it to the top, or very, very near the top, being in the top 20 in the world at one point. And I stayed there for 3 years and did it until I had achieved everything that I thought I was possibly going to do, and then retired. If I had listened to all the people who told me, you're not going to make it, you don't have what it takes, you don't have the money to do this, I would have quit before I ever started. And it's the same thing with the public speaking and all that stuff. There's lots of people that I tell that to, and they're like, oh my gosh, the business environment has changed. It's too tough. You weren't a famous athlete like a football player or somebody like that. Why would anybody pay money to listen to you? You've never had any formal training with writing or doing podcasts or any of that stuff. What makes you think you can make this work? Well, they're not doing it. And therefore, I don't have any interest in their feedback if they're not currently doing the same thing. If they were doing the same things and struggling, maybe there's something to be learned from that, but that doesn't mean I should quit. I should learn to do it a little differently than they are and keep going. I never would have accomplished much of anything if I had listened to the negative voices that are common in my life and everybody else's. I don't have an extra amount of that by any means. I didn't come from the inner city or anything like that. I was a rural farm boy and then moved to Phoenix when I was 12 and come from a humble middle class background. And that was as much as I had stacked against me. But it still was a struggle. There was a lot to overcome. There was thousands upon thousands of people who played racquetball that wanted to get to the very top level and never, ever made it. Some of them never even close. There was lots of people who wanted to get into medical sales and never did. I was able to make that happen, and I did that job for about 3 years. In my current job, we were a startup company, literally an idea scratched out on the back of a napkin kind of a thing, 7.5 years ago, competing with companies that had been around for 15 years at that point. We were underfunded for sure. We really didn't have a real clue to what we were doing, and yet we figured it out. And today I'm the vice president of sales for a company that has client lists such as General Mills and Goodyear Tire and UCLA and Liberty Mutual. It's pretty amazing when I look back on it, what we've accomplished. And again, if we would have listened to everybody that told us this will never happen, you guys will never make it, your competition's too big, too good, too well funded, etc., we according to that, we never should have started. But here we are. So I hope you can learn a little bit from that experience. I'm not special in any sense. I have not led a life of privilege. Anybody can do the things that I've done in their own versions simply by working hard, tuning out the noise, and staying focused on the task at hand. Nobody is self-made. You'll need some help along the way for sure, but you have to tune out the noise of the people who are doing their best to hold you back or quote unquote save you the trouble of trying, because those people are going to look back on their lives and the things they didn't do at some point and have a ton of regret. Even if you fail or fall a little bit short of what you were aiming at, you tried. And when you try and do your best and leave it all out there, that will allow you to sleep at night for sure. As always, I wish you luck in your endeavors. If there's anything I can help with, I don't have all the answers, but I would be happy to share the answers that I do have. So reach out to me through my website and blog at darrenchatter.com/blog or on any of my social media platforms at Darren Chatter. I would love to hear from you and see if I can be of assistance. And once again, I wish you luck in your endeavors.